Hey guys, this is Gary. I want to take somewhat of a deep dive into the basic panel in Lightroom because you will spend a good portion of your post-production editing right here in the basic panel. And not only that, the basic panel shares a lot of adjustments with the gradient filter, the radial filter, and the adjustment brush. These three together are targeted adjustment tools. They allow you to edit parts of the image, whereas the adjustments in the basic panel are global. All right, so let's just dive into this thing. The reason that I'm showing you the histogram is because the histogram can be a valuable reference tool. It is a graphical representation of the different levels of luminance in your photo. So every pixel in a photo has assigned to it a certain luminance value, from 0, which is pure black, to 255, which is pure white. So the potential luminance values for any pixel in a photo are 256. So the sky is pretty bright and the buildings in the ground are pretty dark. Therefore, the histogram here, which is in the shadow area, the left side being 0, the left corner would be a luminance value of 0. This area here would be the buildings and the ground and the trees. This area here would represent the sky. So the sky is mostly highlights with a little bit of midtones. The ground is mostly shadows with just a little bit of midtones. There's not a lot of midtones in this photo, as evidenced by the lack of height here in the middle. So basically, this histogram accurately reflects this photo. All right, so this photo is sort of a compromise. The sky is slightly overexposed. The ground is slightly underexposed. My camera does not have enough dynamic range to accurately capture this scene. Therefore, we can fix it in post-production. So first, in the basic panel, we have the white balance area. So it turns out this photo's white balance is fine. We don't need to adjust the white balance. So I'm going to bring you to a photo where the white balance is clearly off, and that would be this one. So this image was shot in tungsten light. My camera's white balance is probably set to flash. So the deal with white balance is the camera would like the light that it's shooting in to be white. If that light is white, it will be able to accurately render all the other colors as well. So since this image was shot in tungsten, or if you prefer incandescent light, if you're a Nikon shooter, then tungsten light has a little bit of yellow or amber into it, as you can see. So the way white balance works, as the name would imply, is it balances the color so it goes back to white. Since on a color wheel, blue is the opposite of yellow, if I were to add a little bit of blue to this photo, it would push that yellow more toward white. And that's exactly what happens with white balance. So Lightroom is able to read your camera's metadata and offer up the different white balance presets that your camera has. In my case, one of them is tungsten. So if I set my white balance in Lightroom to tungsten, because once again, this image was shot in tungsten light, it automatically corrects the colors. So now this is a lot more accurate. That's one way to adjust your color. Another way would be, this is the white balance selector. Okay, cool. So the way the white balance selector works is if you have a neutral area in your photo, and by definition that would mean the red, the green, and the blue channels in that area are equal, then you can pull your image to the proper color. So if I look down at the bottom of this square here, there's RGB, that stands for red, green, blue channels. The values are not equal. This image is pretty heavily weighted toward red and green and not a lot of blue. The end result being it's slightly warm, which is exactly what it looks like. Well, I know that that iPhone is supposed to be white in that area because, well, it's my iPhone. And it should be white. So if I click with this eyedropper in that area, it automatically pulls the RGB values to be exactly the same. If I go back to my white balance tool, you can see now that the RGB values are almost exactly the same. So there you go. That's the second way to adjust white balance. And then a third way would be to simply take your sliders and eyeball it. So I could just add a little more blue to this photo by cooling down the temperature, and I could adjust it to taste. Same with tint and, so I could pull a little bit more toward magenta or a little bit more toward green, none of which I want to do. So the bottom line here is that of the three ways, eyeballing it would be the least accurate, but there are some photos that don't have any neutral elements in them, in which case you would have to eyeball it. Either way, I'm just going to go with my eyedropper, click, bang, there the white balance is set. All right, back to this photo. Since we don't need to adjust the white balance, we're going to ignore that adjustment. I'm not going to adjust my exposure. So exposure would just be to brighten or darken the photo. Okay, so I'm going to come back to contrast. I want to go right to the highlight slider. The highlight slider will increase just the brightness of the highlights. Notice the buildings in the ground haven't changed, or decrease just the highlights. Look what happens when I pull down the brightness of my highlights. I get all this detail back in the sky, which is what I want. So up in the histogram in the upper right-hand corner, we have what's known as a highlight clipping indicator. And we also, in the left-hand corner, have the shadow clipping indicator. I'm going to activate both of those. So if I take my highlights and brighten them, I get this big blob of red right here. That's telling me these pixels all have a luminance value of 255. There's no detail to be had here. That's why I didn't originally expose this photo for the ground, because had I done so, if I had exposed like that, I would have lost detail in the sky. Okay, so I'm going to pull my highlight slider down. I want to decrease highlights to get back more detail in the sky. That looks really good. I'm going to go with that. Conversely, I can take my shadow slider and open up my shadows. Now I've increased the dynamic range of this photo. All right. However, we can even go further. We can alter. We can set what's known as a white point and a black point. And the way you do that is you hold down the Alt or the Option key, click on the whites slider, move it to the right until you see some brightness start to peek through. These pixels that are peeking through that sea of black have a luminance value of 255 pure white. I've set my white point. Okay, there's a little bit of clipping, but that's fine. Same with the blacks. I'm going to hold down my Alt or Option key, click. All right, I don't really need to adjust my blacks. I'll just maybe pull them down a little bit. So there's some pixels now that are not white. They are now pure black. Okay, so I've increased the dynamic range of my photo by setting a white and black point, closing down my highlights a little bit, and opening up my shadows. I could add some contrast, but that kind of defeats the purpose of lowering my highlights and lightening my shadows. So I'm not going to add contrast to this photo. If I go before, this is before, here's after, I can hit my Y key to show you them side by side. We've made a lot of improvements here. So far so good. Hopefully now you understand all of these adjustments so far. Going down to what is called presence. Clarity. Now that's interesting. I believe clarity should be by the contrast adjustment, because clarity and contrast do very similar things. Contrast will brighten my highlights and darken my shadows. But it does so from the midpoint of luminance, which is 127. Anything lower than 127 would get darker, have a lower luminance value. Any pixel above 127 would get brighter, have a higher luminance value. So it's a pretty ungranular adjustment. Clarity only adjusts the contrast of the midtones. So if I take my clarity slider and move it to the left, you can see that the photo is starting to look really flat and dull. That's because it's lowering the brighter midtones and brightening the darker midtones. If I go the opposite direction, look at how much detail I'm able to get back. That's really good, right? So add a little more clarity. Yes, I've got some clip pixels in the highlights and some in the shadows. That's fine. All right, vibrance. Vibrance and saturation do very similar things. If I move my saturation slider to the right, I increase color intensity. If I move it to the left, I decrease color intensity. All the way to the left, there's no more color. I'm going to turn off my clipping indicators for now. We don't need them anymore. Okay, so if I were to use my saturation slider, I could stop it about somewhere around between 30 and 40. I guess like 34, 35 in that range would be okay. So I've increased the intensity of the color. All right. Well, that looks a little weird to me, so I'm going to double click on saturation, and I'm going to take my vibrance slider and do the same thing. Now I can go farther with my vibrance slider to about plus 74 because vibrance behaves differently. It only intensifies the more muted colors in the photograph. So the fact is, in this photo, all the colors are pretty muted. However, vibrance is always going to prioritize the more muted colors. So it's not a linear adjustment. It's more of an organic adjustment. So the sky looks much more realistic to me. It's beautiful, though. I can see some warm tones in the sky. The blues are more intense, but not overly so. So vibrance, once again, will take more muted colors in a photo and give them more intensity. So it's very useful. All right, so that's it for the basic panel. We're pretty much done, but at this juncture, I want to show you guys a very cool new feature in Lightroom. So in order to do so, I'm going to choose an adjustment brush, which is, well, a brush. And if you look at my cursor, it's now changed to this round thingy, which is basically made up of two concentric circles. If I hit my right bracket key, I can make this cursor larger. My left bracket key will make it smaller. So this is a brush, and anything inside the inner circle will be laying down whatever I've done over here 100%. Anything outside the outer circle, zero effect will be laid down. Anything between the inner and the outer circle will be laid down in a gradual way. In other words, with a feathered edge. So with my brush about this size, so I've got my temperature set to 100. I've amped it up all the way to the warmest possible tone. That's going to be too much, obviously, but I want to see what I'm doing, so I can back off later on. So I'm going to just begin to paint, and literally I'm painting in warm tone on this building, and I can make my brush larger or smaller as I go. So I'm a lefty, and I'm also using a pen tablet, so my stylus is in my left hand. My right hand is on my my left and right bracket keys, so I can come in and paint. Now, I don't really even need to worry about painting over the windows because they're so much darker than the building. But what's going to happen, because I'm not being very careful, I'm going to be painting over these umbrellas, and I'm sort of changing their hue from red to orange. So I'm going to have to come back and fix that. All right, so I've made this building look ridiculously orange. But that's fine. So now I'm just going to simply back off on the adjustment. I was also very sloppy. So what I can do, if I hold down my Alt or Option key, depending on Alt on the PC, Option on the Mac, if I hold down my Alt or Option key, I turn my brush into an eraser. Now, my brush behaviors over here change because the eraser's behaviors are independent of its accompanying brush. So that's good news because I can change the size of my eraser without changing the size of my brush. So I'm going to make the size of my eraser a little larger. I'm going to keep a feathered edge. Now, while holding down the Alt key, I'm just going to paint and erase where I went over the lines a little bit on the roof here. Now I'm going to make my brush smaller by hitting my left, while still holding down my Alt key or my Option key, depending. I'm going to hit my left bracket key to make my eraser much smaller and come in and sort of erase around on the roof where I went over. Now, I could try and, erase the color on the umbrellas or the canopies, but there's a much easier way to do it, and that's where this new feature comes in. Down here, we have what's called the range mask, and there are two modes to it, color and luminance. I'm going to set it to color. And then I get this eyedropper tool. So what I'm going to do is grab this eyedropper and I'm going to click and then sort of drag around. I'm going to basically tell Lightroom that I want to preserve this color. I want to preserve its mask. And if I turn on Show Selected Mask Overlay, so if I move my amount slider to the left, look at that. So basically, the mask is excluding the canopy in a much more detailed way, and the umbrellas. So the bottom line is I'm able to tell this adjustment brush to ignore the red umbrellas and this green canopy and only apply the effect on the building. That is so cool. That saves a ton of time because there would be no other easy way to do this. All right, so that's good. I'm going to hit done. All right, so now I'm back into the basic panel. The buildings are too yellow. I'm gonna activate the adjustment brush. Now, right now, I'm seeing the edit pin and it's gray. If I click on it, I activate this brush. So now I can edit it. And what I want to do, first of all, I want to turn off Show Selected Mask Overlay. And then I'm just going to back off on the temperature. I want a subtle adjustment, something like that, something around 35. That's good. Now the buildings have some more saturation in the yellows. With the new range mask features in Lightroom, it really ups the game a lot. So that's it for now, guys. I will see you in the next video. Bye.